So there's been a lot of conversations recently and a lot of attention on privacy and data regulations. And most of these conversations circle around whether programmatic advertising is going to be somehow detrimented or is going to decrease with the use of data, and these regulations are going to constrict the ability to monetize data. And then on the flip side, you have the more legalese and fear-driven articles about the fines and the regulations and how to comply. And while both have some merit, my goal is to kind of talk more about the opportunities that building a compliance program can create. So I want to level set with just answering a fundamental question of what is privacy. Privacy is about giving people the right to choose what information they share with whom and when. So when you hear these things about these regulations are attempting to stop businesses from using data or trying to prohibit the collection of data, that's really not what the regulations are intending to do. The regulations are intending to just give the individuals the transparency to make the choice of whether they want to share that data or not. And to further that point, there was a recent study done by IBM that found that 81% of respondents say they've become more concerned with how companies use their data. 87% think companies should be more heavily regulated, and 89% said companies should be clearer about how their products use their data. Interestingly, though, 71% said that they would be willing to give up privacy to access certain technological features. And only 45% are actively going in and making privacy changes to protect their personal data. So this 45% of people are already the ones that are on Firefox, they've got ITP enabled, they're on the Brave browser. So this idea of when Chrome makes an announcement about blocking third-party data, these users are already doing it. There may be a slight change, but the ones that are fundamentally concerned about it are already making those technological changes. And that 71% are well aware that their privacy is somewhat being infringed upon, but they know there's a value consideration there that they're willing to accept. So by providing this choice to that 45% of users who are already actively sort of distrusting the ecosystem, you can help regain their trust. It helps you build your compliance program, because that's complying with the law is fundamental. But it also creates business opportunities. And the first opportunity I want to talk about is protecting first-party data. And we've talked about this a little bit throughout the conference. But prior to the regulations coming about, a lot of the conversations about use of data augmentation has been primarily a sales negotiation. The regulations allow for a conversation to be a little more pragmatic and talk about how either partner and their compliance posture is aligned or misaligned, and make sure that there's clean data flows. Knowing what data you have, where it's stored, and where it goes to, and this speaks directly to Article 30 of GDPR, which requires a data inventory. Outside of that, knowing this data is also going to increase the amount of revenue that you can drive from that data. If you know where your data is stored, you know where it's housed, you know where it's going, it's a lot easier to then monetize and leverage it in an IO or a BMP or however it's transacted upon. Lastly, CCPA allows the data subjects the right to opt out of selling of data. This clause has a ton of technical challenges associated with it, but it's important to note that in order to comply with a data subject request, pretty much everything we do is some form of value consideration of selling of data. So be mindful of that one clause in CCPA and have a mechanism or a way, or at least start conversations around how you would comply with that to purge that data if you needed to. One of the strongest tools in the compliance tool belt is a data processing addendum, and you may have seen these come out in flurries leading up to the GDPR enforcement date. This is actually a legally binding agreement that defines who controls the data, who's the processor of the data, what that relationship is, and the exchange. There's terms around auditing, and obviously this is something that you're going to want to put through your legal department and get counsel on. But I would strongly recommend reading through these. You'll find some really interesting terms and be able to decipher how certain partners are considering that data use. To give one example, if you look at SSPs, I've seen DPAs that come across that one SSP will say that they're the data controller. I've seen other ones say that they're the data processor. I've seen some that outright say we're going to do digital fingerprinting. I've seen others that say we're cookie-based and IDFA-based, so it's resettable. And so having an understanding of that and just getting familiar with those terms will help you have the conversations with legal to say, these are the partners that we're considering vetting. Is this aligned with our compliance posture? Is it not? If we're more conservative, you may want to shy away from companies that are doing fingerprinting. If you're a little more lenient, you may want to go, you may be okay with the fingerprinting term. Obviously, the Chrome changes aside. This is just more as it relates to the use of data. And lastly, GDPR requires that not only are you compliant, but that all vendors that you work with are compliant. So these DPAs are essential to make sure that what you're documenting and what you're assigning to is in alignment with how your business is going along their GDPR approach. And one of the things I saw with GDPR was that there seemed to be a mindset that it was a project or a checkbox. It was, put a cookie banner up and I'm good, right? And the reality is compliance is an evolving process. It's not a project. It's not something that you can complete. It's ever changing. CCPA is likely not the last data regulation we'll see. We know there's already multiple proposed state laws. The New York bill is actually more stringent than CCPA. It reintroduces the concept of private right to action. CCPA has since amended that language out of the regulation. But New York introduces putting businesses who process data into a fiduciary role, which is the same thing you see when you hire a CPA to handle your taxes. You're expecting that they're gonna handle that information with your best interest in mind. And New York introduces that law as it relates to data processing. Washington and Texas has both been getting a lot of attention. It's more similar to CCPA, but watch how that plays out. The patchwork state laws it's untenable. It's not feasible to really deal with multiple state laws and multiple countries. So there's pretty active movement at the federal level to put something in place. The one that's getting the most attention and the most traction is one called Detour. And this actually focuses on dark patterns, which is a UX concept by which you create mechanisms to psychologically manipulate the user to consume more media on your platform. So this looks to regulate that, and it strengthens the COPPA law, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. But there are some privacy terms regarding how you can use data to do A/B testing with content and targeting. So it's not quite in the privacy realm, but it's definitely one to keep your eye on. And then the other two that are getting the most attention is the Data Care Act, which has the most support in the House right now. And Do Not Track Plus is another one that's been floated out. Candidly, this one's a little bit of a head scratcher for me because the Do Not Track kind of flamed out because it's very difficult to pass that string across all partners and get publishers to adapt it. The other problem with Do Not Track is that it's very difficult to enforce a regulation when the settings are set at the browser level and you're regulating companies at the site level. And this exact same, it wasn't called Do Not Track, but this exact same principle was introduced in GDPR. There was supposed to be another regulation that came out. It was called the e-privacy regulation. You may have heard the e-privacy directive, otherwise known as the cookie law. That was supposed to roll out at the same time as GDPR, and the technical mechanism was one of the two major hiccups as to why it didn't roll out. And there's also private lobbying at the federal level. And in fact, CCPA is really the way that bill came to be passed as quickly as it did was due to lobbying. That was a ballot initiative that Silicon Valley rallied behind and went to the governor and said, we need to tone this down because it was very heavy-handed on the civil action. So they condensed that down. So there's very active private lobbying. Both IBM and Google have proposed frameworks to Congress. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and talk about one approach, and this is what we do at the tour, of how you kind of create this compliance program. And it creates an opportunity for cross-collaboration, not only across business units, but across the multiple tiers. So we have it structured as we have a steering committee at the top, which is obviously senior leadership, both from a technical perspective and a non-technical perspective. And they're looking at they're meeting quarterly, looking at policy suggestions. They're obviously the sponsors, so that any policies we try to put in place have a little more teeth behind them. And they serve as an escalation point. So moving down to the compliance working group, we have it structured that we have a representative from myself in revenue operations. We have legal. We actually have an internal auditor in there. We have our head of security, and we have records management and retention. And so oftentimes as we're working through how we're going to do things, it's very different approaches. So sometimes we need that escalation point. And so the steering committee can provide that guidance. And what the compliance working group does is we're really the ones that are having our ear to the ground of all of the upcoming regulations, what's changing, how it's going to impact our business, and we're proposing policies to the steering committee. So we're looking at our business and we're looking at how we can, obviously comply with the law first and foremost, but secondly, do the least amount of disruption to the operation. We meet bi-weekly. We're constantly in contact. We're trading articles back and forth, bouncing ideas off each other, and multiple projects in the roadmap. And then lastly, but arguably the most important group, is the privacy ambassadors. And these are individuals at the business unit who these policies are actually impacting. We work with them as we're rolling out new policies. They're the first ones to see it and sort of raise their hand and say, yeah, that's not going to work for us because of X, Y, and Z. We need to do things one way or the other. They're also going to be the ones that are going to say, hey, we're changing vendors on how we store our PII. Like, we need to go through a vetting process. So to circle back to that concept of the data inventory, without the privacy ambassadors, it's nearly impossible to have that complete. So having this full chain of command and communication really helps drive a compliance program that's integrated into the culture of the organization, because no one person can run compliance. It's not a legal problem. It's not a RevOps problem. It's not a marketing problem. It's a company-wide problem. And so the solution has to have voices from all ends. And I'm just going to end with this, and this is, if GDPR was sort of not a concern because EU traffic was low and CCPA and the US regulations are the first year kind of dealing with this, these are the first steps that we took and that I would suggest taking. The first is a privacy impact assessment, and what that is a questionnaire that it's essentially a gap analysis. You look at your organization and where there may be potential gaps, and there's plenty of templates online. There's also some great companies that do third-party audits on this. So if you're interested, let me know, and I'm happy to provide some resources. Obviously, if you're going to go that route, you need the key stakeholders, and this is people that are touching the data, controlling the systems, as well as who it's going to potentially impact if you change processes. Create and update the data inventory. I spoke about that earlier. And then create and update policies. Policies aren't fun. They're not fun to write. They're not fun to read. But having something formally documented and in place will really help steer the compliance program. And also, worst case scenario, if you are dealing with a supervisory authority, you have something to point back to. And then lastly, stay ahead of the new or changing regulations. This space is one of the more rapidly moving that I've ever seen in terms of regulations. There's a lot of attention for, and really it was kind of the perfect storm with GDPR rolling out at the same time as the election, and it really, privacy just kind of got pushed to the forefront. And it's also fairly low-hanging fruit for a bipartisan bill to get put through. So obviously at the state level and federal level, things are changing pretty rapidly. So just stay up to date on it. That's all I have. Thank you.
Nick, thank you. Yeoman's work. Last man up. And I appreciate it. I have two quick questions.
Sure.
How realistic is that we're really going to get an alphabet soup of different regulations? Is there a lot of momentum around using CCPA as sort of the model that's going to just extend and be adopted in one form or another, either at national level or elsewhere?
Yeah, so that's right now, the CCPA is the benchmark. The House has already come out and said that they will not preempt anything. They will not pass any bill that preempts CCPA. So as of right now, assuming all things stay equal in the next election, that'll be the baseline. Obviously, the climate in Washington is a little volatile right now, so I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that we see multiple states before the feds move. There's
also an interesting clash that's evolving regarding the telcos, because the telcos now are owning the digital properties. They have their own set of rules, privacy rules. Do we have any sense of how all that's going to mishmash together? Because they've got the telcos have a whole boatload of information, and they're under a whole set of rules already. Right. But now they're owning a good hunk of the internet.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things there. One is that so the Maine just passed a law and that specifically requires ISPs to gain confirmative consent. So it's starting to get a little heavily regulated. The congressional hearings that I've heard seem to push in favor of letting the FTC regulate privacy. So whether that happens or not, and not to bring in a whole other topic, but net neutrality, one of the big debates was, who regulates that. Is it the FCC or the FTC? And with the repeal, with it no longer being a Title II utility, if that remains and everything can roll into the FTC, I think that would be the ideal. That's total speculation.
Yeah,
That's not.
yeah.
But
that's how.
Yeah.
Which may delay a lot of this,
Right,
too,
that's right.
is that
That's right.
that there's really like a fundamental question at the upper level of where this is going to be regulated.
That's right,
And
that's
and the telcos actually confuse everything.
Yeah,
Make it
for sure.
Nick, thanks very much.
Thank you.
We're going to